So Absolute Green Lantern has a new villain, and it's actually a throwback to an old school Green Lantern villain in DC Comics. But what Absolute Green Lantern issues 9 and 10 do is they open up basically with what we're familiar with. Essentially the power of the Dark Star, right? The villain of the Absolute Universe, as far as the Green Lanterns go, if you want to look at it that way, is it says, Steve Dayton, be with fear. The world that's coming comes closer. Every day, every hour, every second, warn your planet, warn everyone. Be with fear, Steve Dayton. Fear the face of steel. Now, at that point, Steve Dayton is hit with this kind of electric shock that basically overpowers the helmet that he's wearing. But here's something to talk about. Steve Dayton is not just a random person used in this story. Steve Dayton is Mento, and he's actually from Doom Patrol in DC Comics. Now, where Steve Dayton in the main DC universe was, at least pre-crisis, was traditionally like the 5th or 6th richest man in the world and had developed the Mento helmet for the purpose of like enhancing his mental abilities. Here, he's just a guy. And in fact, what goes on is that in the midst of all this, somebody knocks on the door and he asks, right, are you the pizza I ordered? And this guy just says, I'm here with good news. And that's where he's like, close enough. And so that's when you realize it's effectively code, because the door opens, right? And Steve says, but it's I'm here with the good news, Terry, like you're selling religion. Next time, I wouldn't let you in without the exact countersign. And he says, what we're building here has the potential to change the world or destroy it. The potential to see every unspoken thought as it is thought. We cannot let the secret out, not until we are ready. Now, between the layers here and under the radar, what this establishes is that what we've seen so far in the Absolute Universe, right? The idea of absolute evil, the idea of absolute Batman facing off against the absolute Joker or Ra's al Ghul and Superman, that's only really a tip of the iceberg. That there are a lot of people out there that already know what's going on. So in a lot of ways, the Absolute Universe really is not that dissimilar from when the New 52 first picked up. And we basically just joined with these superheroes who had only been around for a few years. The world is much bigger and far more established than we were initially led to believe. And so that's where Terry says, right, we're close though, right? There was that thing this morning. And that's where Steve says, actually, I was repeating that experiment when you knocked. Remember when I told you that I had experienced fascinating hallucinations? I have to be certain of all output, you see. I have to differentiate outside signal from the subconscious noise of my own head. But trying those settings again, it was the same, a vivid mental image. I no longer believe this is hallucinatory, Terry. I think I've made contact. And Terry asks, right, contact? And that's where Steve says a connection to a thought process outside the human experience. The Mento device reached a consciousness beyond this world. It spoke to me. It warned me, Terry. It spoke to me, and God, I am starving. Did you bring lunch? And that's where Terry just turns around and says no. And he has a gun and he opens fire on Steve and kills him on the spot. And that's where Steve is just like, Terry, like what the hell's going on? And this guy says, Terry died after telling me your countersign. Don't feel bad. He was selling you out to Hector Hammond, but he was greedy, sloppy, and difficult. So Hammond called me. My name is Keith, but my call sign on this job is Nemesis. And so he says, any other questions, Dr. Payton? And he says, no. And he says, you're okay if I make a call while I'm here. Thanks, right? Clearly taunting the guy. And so at that point, he says, contact initiated. And the question's asked, are they dead? And he says, line secure. Code word is pentimento, awaiting countersign. And this guy's just like, I don't really care about that. And that's where Keith says, you should, if you are really serious about these things. It can save your life. And so that's where Carol Ferris talks to Hector Hammond, and she says, today's countersign for that agent is Rococo, sir. And so Hector Hammond just says, like, you heard her say the countersign right now. Tell me what's going on. And that's when Keith fills him in, right? Long's disposed of. Do you want me to clear up Dayton's body before your people get here? One thing less for them to do. And that's where Hector just tells him, right? I don't pay you for house cleaning, Kenyon. Do you have the thing? And Keith says, the Mento device. It's secure. It makes you see aliens, apparently. And that's where him and Hector kind of go back and forth, right? Hector says, there's a coincidence. I have another job for you. This one is weird. And Keith just says, I don't really care about whether or not the job's weird. All I care about is that I get paid. What's the name? And that's where he's told, Mullein. Joe Mullein. Now, here's the thing behind Keith Kenyon, and this is why I say he's an old school villain. Keith Kenyon in DC Comics is a villain named Goldface. He's an old school, like Green Lantern Volume 2 character, and I think he was made by Roger Stern, but I'm not going to swear by that. My knowledge on him is not nearly as deep as it is on other characters. But suffice it to say, the whole idea, the whole shtick behind Keith in the main DC universe is that as Goldface, he would have a kind of altered physiology, right? Basically walking around as gold. But he had a gold gun that would fire liquid gold, which really begged the question, why not just fire his gun into some kind of like mold structure and then sell that structure for heaps of money? Right? I mean, I never really understood why he didn't do that. But the fact is, right, this guy is a weakness to Green Lanterns. Why? Well, because long before Jeff Johns introduced the idea that Parallax was an actual entity and was housed within the central power battery of the Green Lanterns, which is why it is that they had a weakness to the color yellow in the first place, that Goldface just kind of appeared on the scene as a person who was able to capitalize on the weakness of the color yellow for the Green Lanterns, because it was just weakness to the color yellow and that was it. And so it made him a pretty interesting villain. Eventually he becomes a Flash villain for a little while, but he was exceedingly obscure. That's why it is you can actually see his character being used here in a completely different way, because at that point you switch back over to Joe Mullein, Cameron Chase, and Hal Jordan. Now keep in mind, at the end of the last video that we covered, Hal Jordan had just basically fallen unconscious, right? He was taken by Sojourner Mullein and then brought to her ex-wife's house, which is Cameron Chase, but there's a lot of history between the two, and you start to see this unfold in the arguments between them, which is actually one of the more fascinating things here. Because when Cameron asks, right, how long is your boyfriend going to sleep on my couch? Joe says he's been out cold for over 24 hours now. Whatever this is, it's not sleeping, and he is not my boyfriend. And she just asks, right, how would I know that? And she says, oh, I know, because he's right there in front of my face, not behind my back. Now, what Cameron's referring to is the fact that Sojourner Mullein actually stepped out on her with Renee Montoya in the Absolute Universe. What's crazy about that is I would never condone cheating in a relationship, but Cameron Chase was a very neglectful romantic partner. She spent all of her time focusing on her job and not really focusing much on a relationship with Mullein. So it was only a matter of time before basically wondering eyes became wondering hands. And Sojourner stopped window shopping and actually stepped into the store to peruse those goods, right? So at the end of the day, they both have fault here, and they've both done some pretty shady things. And in fact, that's some of the history that gets talked about here. That Sojourner Mullein, when she had first met Cameron Chase, had just come out, and she was discovering this whole new world for herself. More so than that, she saw Cameron Chase as someone who was already experienced, and in some ways, I wouldn't go so far as to say was predatory, but kind of capitalized on the naivety of Sojourner Mullein. So ultimately bringing her in knowing that she had all these problems and didn't tell Sojourner about it. But again, there's a lot of frustration and a lot of anger here around these guys. And it's one of these things where Joe just kind of starts lashing out to a degree, because where Cameron Chase tells Joe that she legitimately loved her, Joe freaks out, right? She was like, I was in love with you for a while, but there's only one thing in your life that you've ever loved, your work. And she's like, lucky me, a giant starship dropped on my town, my childhood friend was infected with an evil shadow thing, and now he won't wake up. My boss is a space Jesus full of cryptic warnings about killer planets, and apparently me and some bird guy are being hunted because we're anomalies in the cosmic order. So now I get to be your work. So do you love me yet, Cam? Do you finally want to be around, right? Because that's the crazy thing, is because she feels like the only way that Cameron Chase would actually love her is if Joe Mullein was a subject, something to be studied. Simply her being her isn't enough. And so where Joe Mullein had largely filled Cameron Chase in on basically everything that had happened over the first, 7 or 8 issues of the story, Cameron Chase begins to kind of recite some things back to her, right? Like, you've told me everything. Everyone involved was a human being, at least to start. All but the original alien, the Abin Sur, the Guardian at the green level. Now you're changing your story. Who's the bird guy? And that's where Joe says Tomar Ray, right? He's like me. He's somebody out there who got this power by accident. He's an anomaly, which is where Tomar comes from. She says, I told you how I got this thing, this green level of light. My wedding ring absorbed the Abin Sur's energy, and while it did that, while it imprinted that energy on me, I saw things, visions, a man with hot pink skin and something soulless and metal growing in his mind, a face of steel, a circle of light, a black star. And Tomar Ray, the anomaly of the red light, I saw him and he saw me. And so that's where Cameron kind of looks at all this and it's just like, so take off the ring, right? And Joe kind of asks why. Like, why do you want me to take this thing off? And she's like, think about it. You took Abin Sur's power with the ring. So is it in you? Is it in the ring? Or is it both? And she says, Hal wanted me to take the ring off. At least the thing inside of Hal said that. And so what she does is she takes it off and she's rendered powerless. She has no abilities whatsoever. And so that's where you learn the source of her power is the ring itself. Now that fits in neatly with traditional Green Lantern mythos, which is to say, as soon as a Green Lantern's ring is taken off, they're powerless. They have no abilities whatsoever. What makes this different though, is that the power seemingly goes into whatever object you are wielding and most likely has some level of significance to you. So this very easily could have been a necklace, a dope pair of Air Force Ones, whatever the case happened to be. It ultimately ended up being a ring. So that's a wholly different concept. The fact that the power is confined in an object that's provided by the wielder, as opposed to the power taking the form of a ring that's given to the wielder. So at that point, Cameron Chase takes the ring, puts it on, and then basically shatters this table. And that's when she realizes, okay, so when I have the ring, I don't have the full totality of its power. Only you can use it to its fullest potential, but I can still use it nonetheless. I just used it in a diminished capacity. So she ultimately says, this can make for an incredible weapon. And that's when she goes to the DEO, right? The Department of Extranormal Operations. Now, one of the things to remember here is that Cameron Chase, having been a former romantic interest of Joe Mullein, was taken off the Evergreen case, which is where all this stuff had happened in the first place. The Green Lantern landing in the city and Hal Jordan, Guy Gardner, and John Stewart and all that kind of stuff. And so what ended up happening is her partner Simon Baz, along with Kari Limbo, were given charge of the Evergreen case instead. And that's where you kind of get these really interesting things, where Simon Baz starts talking about how they've been tracking down this trail, which ultimately led them to the identity of Hal Jordan. Not only that, Hal Jordan has associations with Sojourner Mullein, someone that Simon Baz already knows, because as the partner of Cameron Chase, he was in the wedding with Cameron Chase and Joe. And so all these pieces are coming together. And so when Simon Baz and Kari end up leaving to kind of continue their investigation, Johnny Double, who is the head of the DEO, ends up contacting Hector Hammond and telling him that he's got a possible location for that name that was given to Johnny Double. Now, the interesting thing about that statement is that in one of the previous issues, and one of the reasons why Cameron Chase was taken off this whole thing with the Green Lantern, is because of the fact that she accused Johnny Double of being on the take with Hector Hammond, something that he rejected, but now we know it's true. And so what ends up happening is that where Mullein is in this apartment with Hal Jordan is just kind of like, you can wake up any moment now. Things are kind of hectic. There's a knock at the door. And so when she asks, right, like, who in the heck is this? He says it's John Stewart. Right? He's like, I can hear you moving around in there. And so he says, Joe, this is serious. We don't have much time. And where she uses what's effectively X-ray vision to look through the door and see that it's actually John Stewart, she's like, okay, cool. I could trust you. She opens the door. He immediately opens fire because it's Goldface, right? The ability to shapeshift. And so he says, social media is a wonderful thing, isn't it? People just pouring their information out there. Names, dates, photos, videos, those are useful for the audio to get the voice. Getting the voice, that's always the difficult part. And that's where she's like, you're not John. And he just kind of makes fun of her. He was like, you're really a detective, aren't you? You sure are a genius. He's like, that's a gold bullet in your shoulder, by the way. And he says, bad news. According to the intel that Rice gave us, and he says, now there's another one in your gut. So I would stay down if I were you. And he says, anyway, about 20 of the photos that Jordan took with you in them also had this guy, John Stewart of Stewart Architecture, your boss. And I thought he'd be a good face to get your guard down. And he says, lo and behold, I was right. And so where she's like, you're a dead man, he just says, impressive willpower. I should take further precautions. My name's Keith, by the way, but my call sign on this job is Goldface. So again, instead of being a petty criminal, he's an assassin in the absolute universe. And so at that point, you switch over to Todd Rice. Now, we'll talk about him here in a second, but again, he sees the ring, right? Todd Rice, you are an unknown within the spectrum of light. Cord has found you. The forces of chaotic action are upon you. You must be without fear entirely. And then at that moment, this kind of hatch opens up and this guy just says, hey down there, right? Are you okay? I thought I heard a voice. And so that's where Todd is like, you heard it too. Look, man, I'd really like to get out of here. And this guy just says, yeah, I bet. How are the ribs? And he says, I could use more painkillers. And the guy's like, I'll bet. And he's like, feed me the hose. Like, we're going to lock her onto this thing. And so at that point, he was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, look, I told you everything I know. And this guy says, yeah, you're not so useful anymore, Mr. Hammond says, except for this. And so they're literally passing over this giant hose of sorts and hooking it up to the top of this container that Todd Rice is confined in. And that's where the statement's made. So we've got the black ooze from the Evergreen site in tank number 1, sir, roughly 200 gallons. And tank number 2, Mr. Rice, and the instruments to take readings, of course. What happens when a man is completely submerged in the same substance that turned Hal Jordan into what he became? We're expecting the reaction to be significant, Mr. Hammond, and that's where Hector just says, stop teasing and hit it already, and get me another New York sour. Now, here's the thing about Todd Rice. In the Absolute Universe, Todd Rice was just one of the citizens of Evergreen, and really nothing more, nothing less. But when the whole thing popped off with the Green Lantern, he was one of the people who was believed to be dead. He wasn't really taken to Oa, and he was not really analyzed to see if he could become a Green Lantern. Instead, he was just one of the left behind. What ends up happening is that when everything comes to an end in Absolute Green Lantern issue number 5, he's taken by Hector Hammond after telling Hector everything he saw. Now, it wasn't for nefarious purposes or anything like that. He was just telling a guy in a position of authority what he saw because he was told to, right? The Stanley Milgram shock study, right? That kind of philosophy. And so that's what leads him here. But in the main DC universe, Todd Rice is Obsidian, and he's the son of Alan Scott, the original Green Lantern. Now, of course, he goes on to kind of develop his own superhero persona and his own role in the DC landscape, but you see how all these characters that we're familiar with in the main DC universe are in some capacity being restructured and remolded and being made to fit different purposes within the Absolute Universe line. It's why the Absolute Universe line does stand on its own. It is really fun, but it's more enjoyable when you're familiar with DC lore. And so you switch back over to Goldface and Joe. And at that point, Goldface is just like, do you have anything to drink? Right? Just like a soda cola or something like that. The fake voices can really dry out the throat. And she's just like, go to hell. And he's like, all right, well then, let's get into it. And so he says, you've been shot twice. You're dying on your ex's floor. Your friend's unconscious on the couch. I could shoot him. Not like he could stop me. Gold bullets, gold suit, gold face. And he says, gold being the one thing that your green powers cannot touch, which raises so many questions, by the way. And that brings me to my point. You cannot stop me, even if you can summon your whatever it is in the amount of pain that you are in. Goldface, remember? But you don't have to die here. In fact, I would rather that you didn't. There's a reason I didn't just put one in your head, Joe. That's where the intel is. Tell me where the Green Lantern went. And she doesn't really give him any answers here because she kind of gurgles a little bit, mumbles to herself. He's like, what are you talking about? And he says, speak up, Joe. I didn't hear you. And she immediately kicks him in the balls, right? Sends this guy doubling down in pain. And he was like, oh my God, there's blood. He's like, there's blood. And he just starts screaming. He's like, what did you do? And then he realizes it's not his blood, right? She didn't literally bust his balls, right? He's just like, thank God. Thank God. I got to be honest with you guys. I feel like we need a story about Goldface. I love this guy's character. He feels so much like Bullseye, to be honest with you guys. But he says, deal's off, Mullein. The deal is off. Tell me. And then at that point, he turns around and she's gone. But he's like, where are you, Joe? The kitchen? You move pretty fast for somebody who's bleeding out. But she ends up using her power over the Green Lantern ring to melt the door. So we're starting to see that there are powers that she has that are not traditionally associated with Green Lanterns. So it's kind of Al Ewing, slowly building up these small little moments here and there, showing us that she can do things beyond what we would normally expect. So what he ends up doing when he gets to the door, he was like, what the hell, right? Did you jam this thing? Fuse it to the frame somehow? And he's like, that's inventive, Mullein. I underestimated you. Too bad. I'm coming in anyway. And she just tells herself, right, I can't heal unless I get these gold bullets out of me. It's the weakness. It negates her healing factor by way of the green light of power. And so she literally grabs a pair of pliers and starts pulling the bullets out piece by piece, one by one, which takes some balls, man. I have never considered Sojourner Mullein more awesome than I have in this moment right here. Up until this moment, it was just kind of like, whatever. Cool. So they're clearly taking a character from, a newer Green Lantern character and bringing her over, whatever. Now she's dope. Now I love her character. Al Ewing has a way of doing that. And so the whole time, Goldface just taunts her, right? Like, what are you doing in there, right? It sounds like you're crying. Are you crying? And she keeps reaching in for both of these bullets and pulling them out. And he's like, you got a phone in there? Are you calling Chase? That's fine, because I'll kill her too. I will kill everyone you've ever loved. But as soon as the bullets are out, her power manifests. And she's like, know what's not gold? These. And just takes these pliers and sends them crashing into his face. Literally stabs him in the face with these things. The guy's face literally starts melting. And so at that point, she's like, dig the gold out of that. And so in that moment, Simon, Baz, and Kari come walking in and they're like, what in the hell happened here? And Simon's first thought is, this is the apartment of Cameron Chase. There's blood all over the place. Something happened to Cameron. He's like, that's too much blood on the floor. And he says, Cam, if you are there, say something. And that's where Joe shows up and says, Hal Jordan is in a coma, so maybe get the hell out of his face. What are you, a luchador? And he's like, what are you, Joe Mullein? And she says, ask your friend in the kitchen. And immediately Simon Baz thinks it's Cameron Chase and opens fire on Joe. And at that point, she literally manifests a construct and sends him flying into a wall and traps him there. And so that's when Kari refers to Simon Baz by his name. And that's when Joe says, wait, you're Simon Baz. You were at my wedding. And he says, yeah, and I was at your divorce too, right? In the background, behind the scenes. I was the guy who helped pick up the broken wreckage that you left after you crushed my best friend's heart into pieces. And he says, like, we're way beyond all of that now, right? Tell me where Cameron is. Tell me what you did this time, or so help me. And that's where Cameron Chase walks in, right? And she's like, I'm right here. You've got a message in the dead drop, but it looks like you kind of found out already. And she's like, what in the hell happened to my apartment? And so they get to the kitchen where Goldface is. And at that point, Cameron's like, you let him in looking like that? A pair of pliers in his face and his head melted. And that's the funny thing, right? Because at that point, Joe's just like, not with the pliers in him, no, right? Like, I let him in looking like Jon Stewart. He had Jon's face, Jon's voice. Even the gold suit wasn't that crazy. Gold is Jon's whole thing now. And so she says, so you figured the guy who found enlightenment with the space people would show up in a metallic polyester suit from the local party store. Was he wearing a gold hat too? Did that sell it? Now, of course, this establishes two things. The first is the fact that the relationship between Joe and Cameron is amazing. I mean, sure, they're insulting each other, they're definitely toxic, but it would make for an incredibly entertaining story to read. The second thing it establishes is that while Joe Mullein is really awesome, she is kind of an idiot, right? And so at that point, she's like, no, he was wearing magic face change gas. We're not all super spies, Cam, and considering that I fished a gold bullet out of my gut with those same pliers half an hour ago, and that's where she says gold bullets, right? How would he know to use those anyway? How would he know to come here before Simon could check in on me? And she asked the question, who sold you out? And so that's where they start putting pieces together. And so at that point, Simon Baz is like, hold on, back up. Gold bullets, right? And that's where Cameron says the thing that hit Evergreen was called the Green Lantern by its pilot. The green power that's in Joe made it fly, and her gold ring made it crash. Now, of course, again, it is a little more complicated than that, but that's where Cameron says the point is, the green doesn't like gold. Stewart worked it out. Jordan and Joe knew. Who else? And so that's where Kari just says, let's find out, because she's a psychic, and from the main DC universe, she's actually more of a very minor character, like very minor character, to the point that you could just pretend she doesn't even exist. But that's when she says, I'm a level 2 psychic, Simon. Remember? Clairvoyance and psychometry. Reading objects by touch. A dead body is, by any definition, an object. And so Simon asks, right, like, are you sure that's how it works? She's like, I don't know, man. I wasn't born with a rule book. Just let me concentrate and maybe I can do it. So at that point, she touches him and says, contact, right? His name is Keith Kenyon. He works for a man named Hammond, Hector Hammond. And that's where Hammond's like, we have to go. We need to get out of here as fast as we possibly can. We cannot hang around this place. The reason being because, as we learned in Absolute Evil, Hector Hammond is one of a handful of people that have an incredible level of power in the world. To have someone like Hector Hammond hunting after you, it's far more extreme than having like a government coming after you, right? This guy has paramilitary forces all around the world. Money can buy virtually anything. And when you have an unlimited amount of money, you can buy an unlimited number of things, including soldiers and arms and armament. And so what you do is you switch back to Hector. And that's where you have this experiment that's continuing, where they're not quite getting any readings yet. And so at that point, the scientist says, you wanted readings, sir, and we are getting data from the ooze, but there's nothing coming from Todd Rice. No ECG, no brainwaves, nothing. To all intents and purposes, we've created an obsidian shell with no humanity at all inside of it. And that's where Hector says, and you thought that I would be mad, right? That's why I give the orders and you take them, Doc. Humanity is overrated. That's not where the money is. This obsidian of yours, that is exactly what I needed. Because in essence, Todd Rice isn't really obsidian the way we would traditionally expect. Instead, he's encased in obsidian, which means now this process can be duplicated. It can be weaponized and it can be sold. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.